Before we begin, do you enjoy listening to our show? Consider subscribing on your preferred podcast platform or supporting us on Patreon for as little as $3 a month. Link is in the show notes. I'm Harper Finley, and this is Night Watch Files. October 2020. For more than 3 decades, one of Canada's most infamous child murders had remained unsolved. The investigation had consumed countless detectives, generated thousands of leads, and forever altered the lives of 2 families. Every promising avenue had eventually reached a dead end. Detective Sergeant Steve Smith of the Toronto Police Service Cold Case Unit had lived with the case for most of his life. As a teenager, he had followed the investigation through newspaper headlines. Years later, he found himself responsible for solving it. That autumn, Smith attended a 2-week training course on an investigative technique that had recently captured the attention of law enforcement agencies across North America. Just 2 years earlier, the same method had helped identify the Golden State Killer after more than 4 decades of anonymity. If it could solve one of America's most notorious cold cases, Smith wondered whether it could do the same in Canada. A semen sample collected from the 1984 crime scene had been carefully preserved for decades. Advances in forensic science meant it could now be analyzed in ways that hadn't existed when the murder occurred. Smith partnered with a forensic genomics laboratory in Houston, Texas, where scientists generated a detailed genetic profile from the aging evidence. The results were passed to forensic genetic genealogist Anthony Redgrave and his team, who began reconstructing an enormous family tree using DNA voluntarily uploaded to public genealogy databases. Month after month, the researchers followed distant relatives across generations, connecting branches that stretched back more than a century. Eventually, they narrowed the search to the descendants of a single ancestral couple. While combing through historical records, a 19-year-old university intern named Olivia McCarter discovered an Ontario voters list showing 3 siblings living at the same address. One of those names would finally reveal the identity of the person investigators had been searching for since 1984. Born on September 14, 1942, Janet Simpson was considered a miracle child by her parents, who had previously lost 3 boys in the womb. Janet barely survived her own birth and grew up as an only child in a well-to-do Toronto family. She attended the exclusive Branksome Hall private girls' school and was an accomplished figure skater with professional aspirations until a broken bone ended her career on the ice. She subsequently attended business school and spent a decade working as a secretary for Ontario Hydro. Despite her privileged upbringing, Janet's childhood was marked by long periods of solitude while her parents traveled, fostering a tough, stubborn, and fiercely independent streak. The path that led Janet to Bob Jessop began with a serendipitous real estate coincidence in 1962. Janet's parents had befriended a Mrs. Jessop, a woman who worked at their local neighborhood meat store. When the Simpsons purchased a family cottage on Lake Coshlong in the Haliburton region, they were surprised to discover that it was situated directly next door to the Jessop family's own cottage. It was there that Janet met Bob, a thin, laconic outdoorsman with a thick country drawl and a highly irreverent tongue. Bob was working as a telephone system installer for Eastern Independent Telecom, while Janet was employed in the toy and linen departments at Sears. The two hit it off, bonding over a shared appreciation for plain talk and a delightfully earthy, frank sense of humor, though Bob admittedly bristled at the overbearing nature of Janet's father, Gordon Simpson. Their early courtship was tested by tragedy when Bob was 19. His mother died suddenly right in front of his eyes, leaving his father completely lost. Displaying intense family loyalty, Bob remained in his family home for 4 years to help his father readapt to life before finally tying the knot with Janet on October 29, 1966. Determined to escape the sprawling concrete of Toronto for a quieter, semi-rural existence, the newlyweds initiated a steady migration northward. They moved to Newmarket in 1973. During this era, the couple struggled deeply with infertility, visiting multiple doctors who told them Janet could not conceive. They eventually went to the Children's Aid Society and adopted a young boy named Ken. 5 years later, while the family was living in Thornhill, they experienced a massive shock when Janet miraculously became pregnant, giving birth to Christine in late 1974. In 1976, the growing family relocated to Richmond Hill to chase an idyllic suburban dream. However, their lives began to severely fracture in the early 1980s due to Bob's financial misdeeds. It began not as a malicious scheme, but under the guise of familial assistance. In 1981, Bob volunteered to manage the financial affairs of two elderly family friends, 79-year-old John Bullock and his sister, Edith Moss. Trusting him implicitly, the siblings granted Bob their power of attorney, innocently signing checks over to him in what they believed was a secure arrangement. However, rather than managing their estates responsibly, Bob began diverting the funds for his own personal gain, applying their money to pay his own mortgage and using the stolen cash to speculate on the stock market. The embezzlement operated undetected until a mundane financial error brought the entire scheme crashing down. The fraud was exposed when one of John and Edith's rent checks bounced, prompting their concerned landlord to notify the police that something was suddenly amiss with their accounts. The subsequent police investigation led to Bob being formally charged with fraud, a devastating blow that financially ruined the Jessop family and ultimately forced them to forfeit their suburban home, forcing Janet and the children to live temporarily on the family's boat. To rescue his daughter from this housing crisis, Gordon Simpson stepped in with cash to purchase a century-old farmhouse for them on Leslie Street in the quiet, tight-knit hamlet of Queensville. Desperate to mitigate the fallout and avoid serving time behind bars, Bob attempted to make amends. Although Edith Moss passed away before any money could be returned to her, Bob managed to pay back $33,000 to John Bullock. In May 1984, he quietly pleaded guilty to the fraud charges, and his sentencing was scheduled for the following September. In a remarkably poor display of judgment, Bob was convinced that he could manage the legal proceedings on his own and chose not to hire a defense attorney. When he appeared in court on September 17, 1984, he wilted under the harsh scrutiny of a furious judge, barely able to utter a word in his own defense. Angered by Bob's exploitation of two vulnerable seniors, the judge handed down a stern 18-month jail sentence. The immediate fallout landed squarely on the shoulders of his wife, Janet, and their two children. Bob's sudden incarceration plunged the family into deeper emotional and financial strain, leaving the fiercely independent Janet to manage the household alone. To mask the stigma of his imprisonment from the tight-knit rural community, Janet discreetly told neighbors and friends that Bob was simply away on an extended business trip to California. At the center of this fractured household was 9-year-old Christine. Born a miracle child after years of agonizing fertility struggles, she had survived severe early childhood illnesses that initially kept her tethered to Janet as a devoted mama's girl. As she grew healthier, however, Christine's allegiance shifted, and she formed an incredibly tight bond with her father, insisting on accompanying him on errands and visits to the local fire hall. Bob doted on his daughter, viewing her as an innocent, compliant contrast to his rebellious teenage son, Ken. While Ken often required harsh discipline, Bob proudly noted that Christine merely needed a firm no to fall into line. This contrast in parental perception deeply affected Ken, who had been adopted 5 years prior to Christine's miraculous birth. He struggled with feelings of inadequacy and jealousy, keenly aware that Christine was the biological golden child who seemingly could do no wrong in their parents' eyes. Ken felt continuously overshadowed, later recalling, "Christine was the miracle child, especially with my mom. Christine this, Christine that." Consequently, the siblings fought like scorpions, yet beneath the friction, Ken admired his sister's spirit. Christine was a feisty tomboy who loved baseball, threw a ball like a man, and rode her bike freely until the streetlights came on. At the same time, she was an intriguing dichotomy, an innocent fourth grader who nurtured pet chickens and played with dolls, yet a tough, worldly wise girl who occasionally wore makeup, talked about older boys, and casually mimicked her mother's salty profanity. Bob's imprisonment weighed heavily on Christine, exacerbating her childhood insecurities and her longing for her father. The emotional toll culminated on the morning of October 3, 1984. Janet had arranged to visit Bob at the Toronto East Detention Center and made a last-minute decision to pull Ken out of school to accompany her. However, Janet deemed the violent, unforgiving environment of a jailhouse completely inappropriate for a 9-year-old girl, deciding that Christine must stay behind and attend school as usual. Christine was devastated by the exclusion. At around 7 a.m., while Janet spoke on the phone with a family friend, Christine could be heard in the background, inconsolable and crying over being left behind. Despite her daughter's tears and vocal protests, Janet remained firm, placing a deeply upset Christine on the yellow school bus and waving goodbye as she departed for the day. When Janet and Kenny Jessop arrived home from their errands and jail visit shortly after 4 p.m., the quiet atmosphere of their Queensville farmhouse immediately signaled that something was amiss. Stepping into the shed that adjoined the kitchen, they noticed the daily newspaper, leading them to assume 9-year-old Christine was already inside. However, the first unsettling clue lay just inside the shed door. Christine's prized red bicycle was lying on its side on the floor, its handlebar, kickstand, and carrier appearing bent and damaged. This was highly unusual, as Christine routinely parked her bike upright against the freezer. As they moved into the house, a sudden wave of apprehension hit Janet when she saw the family's usually exuberant beagle, Freckles, cowering nervously. Janet scanned the living room carpet for a urine stain to explain the dog's anxious mood, but found nothing. "Kenny, something's wrong," she remarked. The mystery deepened when Ken pointed out that Christine's pink jacket was not on her usual peg, but instead hung on one of the highest hooks in the house, a spot entirely out of the young girl's reach, unless she had stood on a chair. Her backpack, however, rested on the counter, confirming she had indeed made it home from school. Hoping for a simple explanation, Ken yelled down into the basement to see if Christine was playing in the dirt with her pet toad, Harold the Frog, but he was met with silence. In those initial moments, neither mother nor son wanted to alarm the other. Rather than immediately hitting the panic button, they retreated to opposite corners of the house to process the situation. Ken went up to his room and put on heavy metal music, while Janet made herself a cup of coffee to collect her thoughts before placing a scheduled 4:50 p.m. phone call to her lawyer regarding a financial matter. Strangely, in her attempts to chart a calm and rational course of action, it did not occur to Janet to walk next door to check if Christine was with the Morans, despite a recent agreement that the neighbors would keep an eye on the children if Janet was away. By 5:30 p.m., the situation began to escalate. Janet put a pot of potatoes on the stove to boil and left the house to make a quick circuit of the local park, eventually stopping at the general store to buy cigarettes. Finding no sign of her daughter as the streets grew dark, Janet returned home and officially contacted the York Regional Police at approximately 7 p.m. Within minutes, the tight-knit Queensville community grapevine activated, drawing friends, neighbors, and volunteer firemen to the Jessop property. The initial search efforts were largely spontaneous and uncoordinated by the few responding officers, prompting local Fire Chief Lorne Smith to take command, organizing the growing crowd into search parties to comb the nearby cemetery, cornfields, and ravines. As police investigators and friends filled her home, Janet's reaction stood in stark contrast to the frantic environment around her. Neighbors like Marg and Mike Lundgren, along with responding detectives, were shocked by her apparent lack of emotion, noting that she calmly drank coffee and watched television newscasts without shedding a tear. When questioned, Janet rationalized the disappearance with an optimistic, almost supernatural theory. She told friends and police that she possessed a psychic intuition, or ESP, that her daughter was perfectly safe. Janet insisted she could feel that Christine was being kept warm in a wooden building nearby, assuring those around her that the young girl would be returning home soon and was just this far away. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. Inside the home, police began their preliminary investigative steps. Constable Ray Bunt sat down with Janet Jessop to record basic details, noting her description of Christine as a stable, happy child who was aware to stay away from strangers. As the night deepened without any sign of the girl, Detective John Nietzsche escalated the police response, waking Inspector Bob Wilson at 1:30 a.m. to take charge. Wilson quickly dispatched officers on specific searches and ordered the establishment of a mobile command post in the local community center's parking lot. During these early hours, Wilson found himself deeply unsettled by Janet Jessop's eerie composure. Suspecting she might be hiding something, he bluntly warned her about the criminal consequences of causing a public mischief. Meanwhile, another officer knocked on 14-year-old Ken Jessop's bedroom door in the middle of the night, asking the teenager to write out a detailed statement of his exact movements that day. During the initial stages of the missing person investigation, police worked quickly to establish her timeline and learned from a local shopkeeper that Christine had come into the neighborhood variety store alone between 3:30 p.m. and 4 p.m. to purchase bubble gum, leaving just a minute later. They also learned that on that afternoon, Christine Jessop departed her elementary school carrying a newly issued cream-colored woodwind recorder in a velvet pouch, an instrument her teacher had just taught the class to play. Eager to show off her new prize, she took the school bus home, dropped off her backpack, and ventured out again with the recorder. The recorder played a vital role in helping witnesses recount her final steps in the days that followed. When police circulated descriptions and photographs of the missing girl in the media, local resident Robert Atkinson remembered seeing Christine talking to some friends near the intersection shortly after she left the store, because he distinctly recalled the young girl holding the wind recorder. The investigation then quickly extended next door to the Morin residence. Around midnight, officers approached the house after volunteer firemen noticed a deep, freshly dug trench exposing the foundation, but Alphonse Morin warned them away from the construction area, insisting his family had already checked the property. When an officer spoke with Ida and Guy Paul Morin, he noted that the 24-year-old Guy Paul stared straight ahead, showing no apparent interest in the conversation. Adding to the police's early suspicion, Guy Paul firmly refused to provide the officers with the family's private telephone number, citing his charter rights. As dawn broke on October 4th, bringing the first full day of the investigation, Detective Nietzsche traveled to the Toronto East Detention Center to deliver the grim news to Christine's incarcerated father, Bob Jessop. Unlike his wife, Bob broke down in tears of sheer terror and guilt, immediately supplying the detective with lists of acquaintances and the colors of vehicles owned by people he knew. Back in Queensville, local news broadcasts began reporting the disappearance, and the Jessop family provided authorities with a comprehensive list of their inner circle. Despite a massive, coordinated dragnet involving hundreds of volunteers walking through fields with sticks, police divers scouring ponds, and aircraft buzzing overhead, the search party's findings were devastatingly barren. As the first 24 hours drew to a close, police commanders were forced to admit on television that their exhaustive efforts had turned up absolutely zero. The intense media coverage and public pressure created an atmosphere of chaos in Queensville, which Bob Jessop encountered firsthand when he was granted an early release from jail on humanitarian grounds on October 6. Driven back to his village in a police cruiser, Bob stepped onto his property to find it swarming with media, police, and searchers. Reunited with Janet, he maintained the family's facade regarding his absence, never mentioning where he had been to the surrounding crowd. Meanwhile, hoping to shield 14-year-old Ken from the harrowing environment at home, Bob and Janet sent him to live temporarily with the family of Christine's babysitter, Kelly Abbott. As the weeks wore on without any solid leads, police investigators began heavily scrutinizing the family, remaining unsettled by Janet's eerie composure and her insistence on her psychic visions. In mid-October, Janet was taken to a police detachment and subjected to a nearly 2-hour polygraph examination, which she passed, much to her own frustrated relief. Ken and his step-grandmother Hilda Simpson also passed polygraph tests, while Bob actually failed his, though police recognized he was not a serious suspect, attributing the failure to his extreme anxiety and the unreliability of the machine. The police also actively pursued outside tips, briefly zeroing in on Dean MacPhail, a troubled local youth on probation for sexual assault who had previously worked as a gravedigger at the Queensville Cemetery. However, MacPhail was temporarily cleared after his family corroborated his alibi for the afternoon of the disappearance. Investigators also logged an unsettling report from 3 boys who had been searching ditches at night and were approached by a man driving a mud-covered, foul-smelling silver Datsun, but the lead yielded no immediate answers. By the end of October, the massive dragnet had turned up absolutely nothing, and the dark reality that Christine had likely been abducted by a predator settled heavily over the region. In a bid to generate new leads, Crime Stoppers officially became involved by Halloween, issuing a $1,000 reward for any information regarding Christine's whereabouts. The horrific nature of the unresolved crime fundamentally altered the tight-knit hamlet of Queensville. On October 31st, the normally bustling suburban streets were left practically empty of trick-or-treaters, as terrified parents refused to let their children out into the darkness. Throughout November, the initial frenzy of the search had waned, leaving the York Regional Police with a stalled investigation and virtually no concrete leads to pursue. As part of their ongoing efforts to unearth clues, officers conducted a routine door-to-door canvass of Queensville in early November, but came out empty-handed. The lack of substantial progress from law enforcement left the village steeped in paranoia and forced the Jessop family to endure a grueling, open-ended nightmare. With Bob home, the Jessops struggled to navigate their agonizing new reality. Unable to sit idly by as the days turned into weeks, Bob and Janet Jessop fell into a desperate, obsessive routine by the end of November, taking long drives to scour the surrounding countryside for any sign of their daughter. The couple could not relax in public. Even while attending their son Ken's hockey games at the local Newmarket Arena, they gave the matches only a fraction of their attention, choosing instead to obsessively scan the crowds and parking lots. Their agonizing wait was further compounded by cruel prank calls and disturbing mail, including a horrifying postcard from a sender who claimed to have sliced up Christine's body. Frustrated by the lack of police progress, Bob eventually launched his own amateur investigation late that fall after finding a crudely sketched map in his garage that appeared to point toward the home of a quirky family friend, Hector Drummond. Bob and Janet snooped around Drummond's house, discovered a notepad with an impression matching the map, and quickly turned their findings over to the police. The immense strain of the unresolved case also took a heavy toll on Janet's father, Gordon Simpson, who drove to Queensville for a police interview in November, but became so impatient with delays that he stormed out of the house and angrily crashed his car into a tree in the Jessop's driveway. As the month progressed, the emotional toll culminated in a chilling moment that fundamentally shifted Janet Jessop's perspective on her daughter's fate. Several weeks after the abduction, Janet was lying awake in bed when a sudden vision of Christine materialized in front of her, standing with her hands on her hips in the exact pose of the photograph, widely circulated by the media. The apparition briefly asked, "What am I doing here?" before fading away when Janet attempted to grab her. This profound, supernatural encounter extinguished the optimistic psychic hopes Janet had previously clung to. She immediately walked downstairs to her husband and somberly announced that Christine was dead. As November bled into December of 1984, the brittle beauty of the rural autumn was violently replaced by dark squalls and the freezing winds of the Canadian winter. In Queensville, the investigation into Christine Jessop's disappearance remained agonizingly stalled, and the approach of the holiday season cast a dark, suffocating shadow over the Jessop household, as they craved any answers about what happened to their daughter. Bob and Janet Jessop made the difficult decision to forgo a Christmas tree and traditional holiday celebrations, exchanging only a few token gifts for their teenage son, Ken. Fully aware of how excruciating the period would be for the grieving parents, Detective John Niche and Inspector Bob Wilson made a point of dropping by the farmhouse on Christmas Eve to offer their support. Seeking a distraction from their agonizing wait and the unbearable sound of Christmas carols, Bob and Janet spent Christmas Day volunteering at the Scott Mission in downtown Toronto. They spent the holiday ladling out food for the homeless and giving interviews to journalists who were looking for a warm, human interest story. For the Jessops, the charitable work provided the first genuinely positive feelings they had experienced in months. Despite the ongoing media attention and the exhaustive efforts of the York Regional Police, the investigation remained at a harrowing standstill as the year drew to a close. 3 days before the end of 1984, a defeated Detective Niche frankly summarized the bleak reality of the situation, admitting to the press that investigators still had absolutely nothing to go on and were, tragically, right back where they had started on day one. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. On the morning of December 31st, 1984, the attention of Fred Patterson was drawn to the strange behavior of his German Shepherd. The dog was loping around in a nearby farmer's field with a stray Great Dane, barking sporadically into the winter air. The field, located off the 4th Concession Road in Sunderland, Durham region, belonged to a Toronto high school vice principal named James Cull, who kept a small trailer parked on the property. Curious about the commotion and deciding to take a hike to celebrate New Year's Eve, Patterson decided around noontime to investigate. He and his 2 daughters, Shelley and Heather, piled into their truck and drove to the entrance of the tractor path that led into the secluded property. As they stopped near the trampled grass leading to the trailer, Shelley pointed out a colored clump resting about 5 meters into the field, asking, "What's that over there, Dad?" Initially, Patterson dismissed the sight, assuming the property owners had simply dumped some trash. However, Shelley was unconvinced, insisting that the object looked pretty weird to be garbage. While Shelley lingered on the path, Patterson and Heather walked closer to the trailer, noticing its glass door had been smashed. Patterson then instructed his daughters to stay back while he ventured down a beaten-down trail to inspect the strange pile, reasoning that it might simply be a teenage prank involving a dead pig dressed in clothing. As Patterson approached the clump, the gruesome reality came into sharp focus. While the upper torso was a scattered collection of bones, he recognized human legs ending in feet that were clad in white socks with blue trim. Horrified, Patterson rushed back, grabbed his daughter's hands, and hurried them back down the tractor path to their truck. Desperate to shield them from the traumatic discovery, he lied to the girls, assuring a frightened Shelley that it was merely a dead animal. The family drove back to their house in near silence. Leaving his daughters in the safety of the car, Patterson brought his wife, Jeanette, back to the secluded site. Jeanette cautiously approached the horrific scene, taking in the scattered remains and the tattered clothing in the brush. "My God, it's a child," she cried out in horror. The couple quickly retreated to their home and contacted the Durham Regional Police just after 1 p.m., bringing a devastating conclusion to the 3-month search for 9-year-old Christine Jessop. When the police arrived at the scene, the missing person case of Christine Jessop officially transitioned into a homicide investigation. Because the 9-year-old's remains were discovered in a secluded farmer's field in Sunderland, traditional protocol dictated that the Durham Regional Police automatically assume jurisdiction over the case from the York Regional Police, who had spent the previous 3 months searching for the girl. Detective Bernie Fitzpatrick of the Crimes Against Persons Squad was the duty officer that New Year's Eve and immediately took command of the scene, ordering constables to string up yellow police tape across the tractor path leading to the remains. Upon viewing the scattered, partially skeletonized body and the torn blue clothing, Fitzpatrick radioed for a York Regional Police missing person flyer to compare the garments to what Christine was last seen wearing. Fitzpatrick and Sergeant Mike Michalowski, the identification officer, donned rubber gloves and conducted a preliminary ground search on their hands and knees. They quickly located Christine's cream-colored Allos woodwind recorder inside its tan pouch, still bearing a piece of masking tape with her name printed on it, effectively confirming the victim's identity. As the afternoon progressed, off-duty Durham officers arrived to assist, forming a line to comb the area, which turned up a few more items including a credit card receipt and a milk carton. While the police secured the crime scene in Sunderland, the devastating task of delivering the news to the Jessop family in Queensville was set in motion. Early that evening, Reverend Bev Hall of St. Mary's Anglican Church was preparing to leave for a civilized New Year's Eve dinner when York Regional Police Chief Crawford, Inspector Robert Wilson, and Detective John Nietzsche arrived at her door. Knowing immediately that the visit meant the hope for Christine's safe return was gone, Hall accompanied the officers to the Jessop farmhouse. Inside, Janet and Bob Jessop had just finished a meal with Ken and were trying to dredge up positive thoughts for the new year, with Janet having spent part of her afternoon consulting her psychic friend. As the solemn entourage stepped into the house, Chief Crawford delivered the crushing blow, informing the family that human remains and clothing matching Christine's description had been found, adding, "We're 99.9% sure it's her." The atmosphere in the room fractured into cycles of profound weeping, impotent fury, and desperate philosophizing. A devastated Janet repeatedly demanded to know, why Chrissy, while Reverend Hall struggled to offer spiritual comfort. For Bob Jessop, the confirmation of his daughter's death brought a sickening, hollow sense of finality to the agonizing 3-month wait. Capturing the grim reality of their new nightmare, Bob stated, "In a way, it is good that it is over, in a sense of not knowing. But now it is a question of who did it." The new year of 1985 began with the grim task of examining the recovered remains of 9-year-old Christine Jessop. On January 2nd, Ontario's chief pathologist, Dr. John Hilsden Smith, commenced the autopsy, determining that the young girl had suffered sharp blows to the head and had been sexually assaulted and stabbed to death. Investigators deliberately withheld the exact cause of death from the public to help weed out false confessions. The autopsy and the recovery of Christine's clothing raised perplexing questions for the detectives. Christine was found wearing a gray turtleneck sweater her family did not recognize, and the presence of semen stains directly on the crotch of her underpants suggested the killer had redressed her after the initial assault, likely at a different location than where her body was dumped. Meanwhile, Sergeant Mike Michalowski and other officers continued to scour the frozen body site in Sunderland, recovering a few more scattered bones. A few days later, a profoundly grieving Queensville community gathered at the local United Church for Christine's funeral. The service, presided over by Reverend Bev Hall, was heavily attended by media and undercover police officers actively scanning the crowd for the killer. Christine was buried in the cemetery directly behind the Jessop family's Leslie Street farmhouse, accompanied by 50 red roses and her favorite Cabbage Patch doll. Later that evening, as friends and family gathered at the Jessop home to mourn, the solemn atmosphere was pierced by a chilling incident. Some guests heard a voice crying out from the darkness outside, "God, please help me." Although a quick search of the snowy perimeter yielded no footprints or clues, the eerie cries added to the family's trauma. In the days following the funeral, the strain took a severe toll on Christine's 14-year-old brother, Ken, who suffered from nightmares that the killer would return to the cemetery to steal his sister's bones. Concerned for his well-being, Janet and Bob Jessop planned to take him to a psychiatrist. Throughout January, the Durham Regional Police, who had assumed jurisdiction over the homicide, struggled to generate concrete leads. The physical evidence from the crime scene was funneled to the Center of Forensic Sciences, where analyst Stephanie Niesnick began the arduous task of examining hairs and fibers. Detectives Bernie Fitzpatrick and John Shepard investigated several local suspects, including an elderly family friend named Hector Drummond, whose home was located near the body site, and Dean McPhail, a troubled youth with a history of sexual offenses who had previously worked at the Queensville Cemetery. However, by the end of January, both men had been largely dismissed as viable suspects by the investigators. With the investigation stalling, detectives pivoted their focus back to the Jessop's immediate surroundings in February 1985. During a February 14 interview to re-examine the family's timeline, Janet Jessop expressed her distaste for her next-door neighbors, describing 24-year-old Guy Paul Morin as a weird-type guy who kept to himself, tended to bees, and played the clarinet. This characterization instantly piqued the detectives' interest, aligning neatly with their evolving theory that the killer was an eccentric local. On February 19th, police initiated active surveillance on the Morin household. The police scrutiny culminated a few days later when detectives Fitzpatrick and Shepard approached Morin outside his home and invited him into their police cruiser for an interview. Morin, oblivious to the fact that he was a prime murder suspect, was remarkably talkative and cooperative. As a hidden tape recorder captured the conversation, Morin cheerfully discussed his music and his bees, but also offered bizarre, unsolicited remarks. When asked about Christine, he described her as innocent, adding the cryptic observation that all little girls are sweet and beautiful, but they grow up to be corrupt. He also accurately noted that her body had been found across the Ravenshoe Road, a detail police found highly suspicious despite it being a plausible geographic deduction. Although the police tape recorder malfunctioned halfway through the interview, failing to capture the rest of the exchange, the detectives left the encounter completely convinced of Morin's guilt. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. To rationalize Morin's seemingly innocuous, chatty demeanor, the detectives developed a split personality theory, postulating that a homicidal persona lurked beneath the quiet musician's exterior. However, a significant logistical hurdle stood in their way. Morin's work time cards indicated he had clocked out at 3:32 p.m. and would not have arrived home before 4:14 p.m., leaving him virtually no time to abduct Christine if Janet and Ken Jessop had indeed returned home at 4:10 p.m. On March 6th, the detectives visited the Jessop farmhouse to reevaluate this timeline. Suggesting that the Jessop's kitchen clock might have been running slow, the investigators successfully persuaded Janet to amend her estimated arrival time to 4:35 p.m., effectively creating a 25-minute window of opportunity for their prime suspect. As the police aggressively narrowed their focus, Bob and Janet Jessop became increasingly obsessed with the investigation, transferring their trust away from the York Regional Police and aligning themselves closely with the confident Durham detectives. The agonizing wait took a severe toll on the family dynamic. particularly affecting 14-year-old Ken. Having been sent to live temporarily with friends to escape the suffocating atmosphere at home, Ken sank into a sullen depression, plagued by recurring nightmares of his sister's remains lying in a forest. Bob and Janet, meanwhile, were so emotionally depleted that they eagerly grasped at the Durham police's assurances that the killer was in their sights. Seeking to bolster their case, Fitzpatrick and Shepard enlisted the expertise of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit. In late March, Special Agent John Douglas traveled to Toronto, visited the crime scene, and generated a psychological profile of the killer. The profile described a 19 to 26-year-old intelligent white male who lived in the Queensville area, possessed a sloppy appearance, and operated primarily at night. To the detectives, the description fit their 24-year-old, eccentric next-door neighbor perfectly. Douglas advised the investigators to adopt a proactive strategy, suggesting they use the media to release details of the profile to agitate the suspect, driving him to make a mistake before bringing him in for a heavily choreographed interrogation. Before making an arrest, the police needed physical evidence to definitively link Morin to the crime scene, specifically to match a hair found entangled in Christine's necklace. The detectives orchestrated an undercover operation at Morin's community band practice. Constable Ann Crawford, posing as a cosmetology student needing samples for a class project, successfully coaxed Morin into letting her pluck several hairs from his head. The following morning, Center of Forensic Sciences, CFS analyst Stephanie Niesnik informed the elated detectives that Morin's hair matched the necklace hair on 3 points of comparison. Armed with this preliminary forensic endorsement, Fitzpatrick and Shepard secured a search warrant on April 16th to secretly extract fiber tapings and a seat cover from Morin's Honda. Days later, Niesnik reported that fibers found in the car shared similarities with fibers recovered from Christine's clothing and her recorder pouch. Following the FBI's advice to flush out their suspect, the Durham police held a press conference to announce the behavioral profile and reveal that Christine had been stabbed to death. Watching the evening news broadcast, Alphonse Morin remarked in astonishment that the description of the unkempt, night-dwelling local youth sounded exactly like Guy Paul. The Jessops were equally stunned, realizing for the first time that the police were targeting the young man next door. The investigative dragnet finally snapped shut on the evening of April 22, 1985. At 7:45 p.m., as Morin was driving his Honda to a band practice, an unmarked police cruiser pulled him over on Highway 48. Detectives Fitzpatrick and Shepard approached the vehicle and bluntly informed the 24-year-old that he was under arrest for the first-degree murder of Christine Jessop. Registering pure shock and assuming it was a bizarre joke, Morin was handcuffed and placed in the back of the cruiser, while a massive police search team simultaneously descended upon his parents' home. As Guy Paul Morin was being driven away in handcuffs on the evening of April 22, 1985, a massive swarm of Durham Regional Police officers descended upon his family's Queensville home. Alphonse and Ida Morin were outraged as searchers bypassed their protests to execute the warrant. The investigators found a house in utter disarray, likened by searchers to an archaeological dig overflowing with tools, drywall, and scattered clothing. 2 officers stayed glued to the parents to monitor them and prevent interference, while the search team spent the night bagging items and even clipping hair from the family's dogs, Jesse and James. Despite the intensive 12-hour sweep, the police failed to find the items they most desired: a missing button, a gold seat cover, Christine Jessop's blue hand-knitted sweater, or a blood-encrusted knife. When Alphonse coldly asked if the police had installed bugging equipment, Detective Peter Hawley smugly replied that while the doors had been open all night, it was too early in the year for bugs. Directly across the driveway, the Jessop family reveled in the spectacle. Bob and Janet set up chairs on their veranda, drinking in the sight of the police raid and listening to Ida Morin scream obscenities. It was great, Janet later reminisced, though she expressed one lingering frustration. She wished the police had broken into the concrete supports Guy Paul had recently poured in his basement, convinced Christine's missing blue sweater was hidden inside. The next day, as the media swarmed the property, the Jessops gave numerous interviews. Bob stated he had nothing left to hit Morin with, while 14-year-old Ken issued a pugnacious threat to the television cameras, warning that if Morin was released, he would be waiting on the front steps of the jail and the suspect wouldn't be walking long. Thrust into the media spotlight, the Morin family urgently sought legal representation, retaining high-profile Oshawa lawyers Bruce Affleck and Alex Sosna. Affleck enthusiastically marketed himself to a bewildered Morin, boasting of his 149 IQ, his extensive murder trial experience, and his influential contacts. Meanwhile, Morin was plunged into the terrifying reality of Whitby Jail. He was placed in what guards mockingly called the bridal suite, a pink-walled solitary confinement cell in a former women's range that contained no sink or toilet, only a hole in the floor. Enduring taunts of baby killer from other inmates, Morin suffered severe depression, unable to stomach food for days. Eventually, he was introduced to a new cellmate, Jeff Rickert, who was actually undercover police sergeant Gordon Hobbs, planted to extract a confession. While Morin offered bizarre monologues about redrum and the disciplined minds of monks, he vehemently maintained his innocence, leaving Hobbs with ambiguous, cryptic statements rather than the definitive admission the police sought. The psychological strain on Morin culminated 2 months later, following an emotional jailhouse visit from his father and brother on the evening of June 30th, 1985. Depressed over his recent preliminary hearing and the terrifying prospect of standing trial for a murder he insisted he did not commit, Morin returned to his range and sought comfort from his new cellmate, Robert Dean May, and a neighboring inmate known as Mr. X. May was a manipulative 22-year-old con artist and pathological liar who had recently been brutalized by guards following a failed escape attempt, while Mr. X was a serial sex offender. Unfamiliar with the treacherous dynamics of prison survival, Morin made the catastrophic mistake of trusting them, quietly weeping to May about his wrongful incarceration. Sensing what appeared to be a significant development in the investigation, May and Mr. X contacted detectives Doug King and John Shepard the following morning. The two inmates claimed they had overheard Guy Paul Morin suffering an emotional breakdown in his cell overnight. According to Mr. X, Morin had been crying uncontrollably before exclaiming, "Fuck, man, fuck, I killed her. I killed that little girl." The information immediately drew investigators' attention. In return for their cooperation, May and Mr. X sought various concessions, including reduced sentences, dropped charges, and transfers to a halfway house. Believing the alleged confession could strengthen their largely circumstantial case, prosecutors agreed to use the inmate's testimony, and the two jailhouse informants soon became key witnesses for the Crown at trial. The first-degree murder trial of Guy Paul Morin commenced on January 7, 1986, in a London, Ontario courtroom, moved from the Toronto area due to intense media publicity and fear of local bias. Led by prosecutor John Scott, the Crown presented a largely circumstantial case resting heavily on forensic evidence and the testimony of jailhouse informants. Center of Forensic Sciences analysts Stephanie Niesnick and Norman Erickson testified that a single hair found caught in 9-year-old Christine Jessop's necklace was a microscopic match to Morin, while 3 hairs recovered from Morin's Honda matched Christine's. They also claimed that textile fibers recovered from the victim's clothing and recorder pouch could have originated from Morin's home and vehicle. The prosecution bolstered this physical evidence with the explosive testimonies of inmates Robert Dean May and Mr. X. They told the jury that Morin had suffered an emotional breakdown in his cell and confessed to killing the young girl, with May adding that Morin claimed his way of dealing with frustration was to redrum the innocent. Morin's defense team, led by Clayton Ruby alongside Mary Bartley, mounted a fierce counterattack against the prosecution's witnesses. Ruby relentlessly cross-examined the forensic analysts, forcing Niesnick to admit that the fiber matches were merely similar and could have easily been the result of environmental contamination or shared neighborhood environments, such as the local laundromat both families used. Ruby further devastated the Crown's credibility by exposing a shocking police fabrication regarding a cigarette butt found near the victim's remains. He revealed that investigators had pressured Constable Tom Cameron into falsely claiming he had dropped the butt at the crime scene, a narrative that fell apart when Ruby demonstrated the brand Cameron smoked did not match the recovered evidence. The defense also shredded the reliability of the jailhouse informants, exposing May's history as a pathological liar and Mr. X's background as a convicted sex offender who bartered his fabricated testimony for potential favors and sentence reductions from the police. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. Morin eventually took the witness stand in his own defense, nervously but adamantly denying that he had anything to do with Christine's death. He attempted to explain away his bizarre redrum and monk's mind comments made to the informants and an undercover officer as foolishness, sarcasm, and word games. His parents, Alphonse and Ida, also testified to corroborate his alibi, asserting he was home at the time of the abduction. Then, in a maneuver that shocked the courtroom and infuriated the prosecution, Ruby introduced a last-minute alternative plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. Ruby cautioned the jury to only consider this defense if they first concluded Morin committed the crime. To support this fallback position, psychiatrists Graham Turrell and Basil Orchard testified that Morin suffered from simple schizophrenia. In a highly controversial statement, Turrell suggested that if Morin had killed Christine, he would have been in an acute psychotic state, perhaps believing he was touching her with a magic wand to give her life. In his closing address, Ruby delivered a strong speech, warning the jury about the dangers of police tunnel vision and arguing that the state had microscopically focused its vast resources on an innocent, mentally ill man who simply lived next door. Prosecutor John Scott followed with a closing that failed to match Ruby's eloquence. When Judge Archibald McLeod Craig delivered his final instructions to the jury, he made a critical, contradictory error in defining reasonable doubt, blurring whether the standard applied to individual pieces of evidence or to the case as a whole. After 14 hours of agonizing deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom on February 7, 1986, and delivered a verdict of not guilty. A stunned but ecstatic Morin was freed, stepping outside the courthouse to tell the swarming media that the system had proven him innocent. Guy Paul Morin's release on February 7, 1986, brought him no real peace as he returned to the highly hostile hamlet of Queensville. The crippling costs of his defense had drained his family's savings, forcing Morin to abandon his home renovations and take a job wiring houses for telephone service, eventually wiring about 2,000 homes. Meanwhile, his neighbors circulated a petition demanding the Morin family leave the community, as terrified villagers remained convinced that a killer was still living in their midst. Across the driveway, Bob and Janet Jessop were plunged into deep despair and anger. Returning to a home that now felt unbearable due to its proximity to the man they remained absolutely certain was their daughter's murderer. Unable to sell their property after listing it on the market, the Jessops packed away Christine's photographs, gave away her toys, and sold her bedroom furniture. The trauma severely affected 14-year-old Ken Jessop, who grew increasingly resentful of his mother's media obsession, taking to long, solitary walks in the local graveyard, where he would sit for hours in brooding silence. Determined not to let the acquittal stand, Bob and Janet Jessop launched a relentless lobbying campaign directed at the Ministry of the Attorney General. Within the ministry, prosecutors David Fairgrieve, James Blacklock, and Ian McDonnell carefully reviewed the trial and homed in on a critical mistake made by Judge Archibald Craig. They noted that the judge had given the jury contradictory instructions regarding the legal definition of reasonable doubt and had also improperly restricted the jury from using the defense's own psychiatric evidence to determine whether Morin had actually committed the murder. Convinced these errors provided the necessary legal footing, Assistant Deputy Attorney General Douglas Hunt and Attorney General Ian Scott approved the challenge. On March 4, 1986, less than a month after Morin walked free, the Crown officially filed an appeal against his acquittal. The legal battle escalated on June 5, 1987, when the Court of Appeal for Ontario ruled in favor of the Crown, overturning the acquittal and ordering a new trial. In a devastating blow to Morin, he was abruptly rearrested and, to his fury, handcuffed by detectives Bernie Fitzpatrick and John Shefford, despite turning himself in voluntarily. During his subsequent bail hearing, prosecutors argued that Morin's supposed severe mental illness made him a danger to the public, but the Court of Appeal ultimately granted his release on $40,000 bail. Morin's defense team, led by Clayton Ruby, immediately escalated the fight by appealing the decision to the Supreme Court of Canada. As the years dragged on, the Jessops agonized over the delays, eventually threatening to launch a nationwide protest and petition campaign if the federal justice minister did not expedite the Supreme Court's ruling. Shortly after their ultimatum, on November 17, 1988, the Supreme Court unanimously dismissed Morin's appeal and upheld the order for a retrial. The justices ruled that while the trial judge had been correct to limit the application of the psychiatric evidence, his fundamental misdirection to the jury regarding the standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt legally necessitated a new trial. With the appeals exhausted, Clayton Ruby felt his role had concluded and formally stepped down, recommending that the Morins hire Jack Pinkowski and Elizabeth Widner to take over the defense. The new legal team immediately launched aggressive appeals citing double jeopardy rules and the Crown's failure to disclose exculpatory evidence, initiating a massive, protracted series of pretrial motions. These intense legal maneuvers heavily delayed the proceedings, pushing the commencement date of Guy Paul Morin's second first-degree murder trial to May 28, 1990. Relocated to London, Ontario, the retrial devolved into a grueling war of attrition that would consume over 2 years and roughly $11 million in taxpayer funds, making it the longest murder trial in Canadian history at the time. The courtroom became a bitter battleground, pitting defense lawyers Jack Pinkowski and Elizabeth Widner against Crown prosecutors Leo McGuigan and Alex Smith, with Judge James Donnelly presiding. A pivotal and macabre development occurred mid-trial when the defense unearthed the fact that the Jessop family had found unidentified bones at the body site weeks after Morin's initial arrest in 1985, evidence that had never been properly inventoried or disclosed. To determine the truth, Christine's remains were exhumed on October 30th, 1990. Inside the coroner's building, a team of forensic anthropologists, including Dr. Jerry Melby and Dr. Clyde Snow, examined the remains and discovered massive injuries completely missed by the first pathologist during the original 1985 autopsy. They found multiple cut marks on the neck vertebrae, indicating a prolonged attempt to dismember or decapitate the victim, as well as a severe facial fracture radiating from the nasal bones that would have caused unconsciousness or death. The staggering revelation of these missed injuries severely undermined the prosecution's timeline, as experts estimated the mutilation would have taken an amateur up to 45 minutes to inflict, rendering Morin's brief window of opportunity even more implausible. Back in the courtroom, the Crown sought to bolster its highly circumstantial case by calling new witnesses to demonstrate Morin's alleged consciousness of guilt. The jury heard dubious testimony from neighbors like Patty Hester, who claimed Morin angrily chased her away from his car, and Constable David Robertson, who asserted his police dog had tracked Christine's scent to the door of Morin's Honda on the night she vanished. The prosecution also relied heavily on the notoriously unreliable jailhouse informants, Robert Dean May and Mr. X, who repeated their claims of hearing Morin confess, despite the defense exposing their history of perjury and attempts to trade their testimony for favors. The trial took a profoundly tragic turn when Christine's older brother, Ken Jessop, testified and revealed a hidden history of childhood sexual abuse involving himself, two older youths, and Christine. However, Judge Donnelly severely restricted Pinkowski's ability to use this revelation to point to alternate suspects or motives, hamstringing the defense. As the trial drew to a close, Pinkowski delivered a passionate multi-day address warning the jury about police tunnel vision, lost and contaminated evidence, and the danger of the state focusing its vast resources to frame an eccentric neighbor. In contrast, McGuigan delivered a highly effective, methodical closing, utilizing a visual display of a Bristol board laced with red ribbons to dramatize the alleged forensic fiber and hair links between Christine's clothing, Morin's car, and his home. The defense's hopes were further eroded by Judge Donnelly's charge to the jury, which subtly favored the prosecution by highlighting the Crown's forensic experts while dismissing the defense's experts, introducing alternate prosecution theories, and downplaying the significance of police errors and missing evidence. On July 30th, 1992, after an agonizing 8-day deliberation that saw one pregnant juror rush to the hospital to give birth, the jury returned its verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom reacted in stunned polarization. The prosecutors and the Jessop family expressed immense relief that the killer was finally paying for the crime, while Morin, his family, and his lawyers were paralyzed by shock. Standing in the prisoner's dock, a pale and trembling Morin gripped the railing and declared to the judge, "I'm not guilty of this crime. It is a travesty of justice, what has happened here today and throughout this whole ordeal, and I'm appealing this verdict." Despite his protests, Guy Paul Morin was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for 25 years. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. Following Guy Paul Morin's devastating first-degree murder conviction on July 30th, 1992, public reaction swiftly coalesced into a grassroots movement that led to the formation of the Justice for Guy Paul Morin Committee. Comprised largely of volunteers naive to the political process, but possessing boundless energy, the committee's immediate course of action was to help Morin appeal his conviction and apply for his release on bail while he awaited a decision. To rally public support and pressure the justice system, the committee organized letter-writing campaigns, circulated petitions, held a candlelight vigil, and distributed buttons bearing the names of prominent Canadian wrongful conviction cases: Marshall, Milgaard, Morin. On the eve of his bail hearing, they also held a high-profile press conference featuring well-known social activists like June Callwood and Reuben Hurricane Carter. The campaign achieved a stunning legal victory on February 9, 1993, when Justice Marvin Katzman of the Ontario Court of Appeal granted Morin bail, noting that all the grounds for his appeal were clearly arguable. Katzman set bail at $120,000 and imposed strict conditions, ordering Morin to live with his parents in Queensville, report to the police weekly, remain in Ontario, and avoid associating with any child unless an adult was present. Empowered by this monumental success, the committee expanded its mandate to fight for all wrongfully convicted Canadians, reconstituting itself as the Association in Defence of the Wrongly Convicted, which is now known as Innocence Canada. Morin's return to the outside world after serving 18 months in prison was not without controversy. Just days after his release, a reporter and photographer from the Toronto Sun staked out the apartment of Morin's then-girlfriend, Fiona, on Valentine's Day. Tricking the couple into posing for a celebratory photograph while clinking champagne glasses, the tabloid published a sensational front-page story the next morning depicting Morin as flaunting his freedom while the victim's mother wept. The incident infuriated Ontario Chief Justice Charles Dubin, who privately rebuked Morin's lawyers and warned that any further public violations of his bail conditions such as consuming alcohol, could result in his immediate return to Kingston Penitentiary. Determined to structure a normal life while his appeal loomed, Morin eventually split from Fiona and fell in love with Alison Ferguson, a Metro Toronto police dispatcher who had written him supportive letters during his incarceration. With his family's blessing, the couple married in a dawn ceremony on the Caribbean island of St. Thomas. They purchased a modest home with a swimming pool in the Toronto suburb of Mississauga, where Morin played ping pong, enjoyed the company of his puppies, and painstakingly restored a grand piano. Establishing a one-man company called Paul's Handiworks, Morin worked quietly as a carpenter, auto repairman, and piano tuner, trying to stave off the agonizing dread that he might be sent back to prison for 25 years. For the Jessop family, Morin's release and the swelling public belief in his innocence were devastating blows that deepened their grief and internal fractures. Bob and Janet, now living separately, wept and raged in their respective homes when the bail decision was announced. Following the Valentine's Day tabloid photograph, Janet publicly expressed her disgust, telling the press she felt Morin was dancing on her daughter's grave. Bob Jessop spent weeks waking in the early hours of the morning to pace his new home in anguish over the apparent meaninglessness of Christine's death. His relationship with his son Kenny also deteriorated completely during this period. Bob formally banned Ken from his property after the young man, struggling with severe psychiatric issues and depression, broke into his father's house to steal liquor. As the appellate preparation reached a fever pitch in late 1994, the Crown and defense agreed to submit the preserved semen stains from Christine Jessop's underwear for advanced PCR-based DNA typing, a highly sensitive technology that had not been available during Morin's trials. The biological evidence was sent to a laboratory in Boston, and shortly after Christmas, scientists confirmed they could extract a definitive result. In January 1995, the test results definitively excluded Guy Paul Morin as the source of the genetic material. On January 23, 1995, just days before the appeal was scheduled to be argued, a special 5-judge panel convened at the Ontario Court of Appeal. Crown Prosecutor Ken Campbell asked the court to enter a directed verdict of acquittal, stating that the DNA evidence proved as an indisputable scientific fact that Morin was not guilty of first-degree murder. Morin's conviction was officially set aside, and Campbell offered a profound public apology for the dreadful ordeal the Morin family had endured. Stepping out of the courthouse to the cheers of his supporters, a fully exonerated Guy Paul Morin addressed the media, reflecting, "The justice system failed me, but science saved me." Following his exoneration, Guy Paul Morin was finally free, but the hunt for Christine Jessop's true killer had to essentially begin anew. In February 1995, recognizing the deeply compromised nature of the original investigation, the Ontario Attorney General's office stripped the Durham Regional Police of their jurisdiction and transferred the cold case to the Toronto Police. A special 9-man task force was quickly assembled under the command of homicide detectives Neil Tweedy and Stephen Holcoop. Their first steps involved a massive organizational effort to computerize the sprawling, decade-old case file, cataloging 3,700 names, 3,000 police reports, and 37,000 pages of court transcripts. Armed with the actual killer's DNA profile, the task force engaged in an aggressive sweep, interviewing over 300 individuals and taking blood samples from dozens of potential suspects to compare against the genetic evidence. Despite this renewed vigor, the task force faced seemingly insurmountable challenges. The trail had grown cold over the intervening 10 years, and many of the original leads had been tainted beyond repair by the tunnel vision and coercive tactics of the initial Durham investigators, Bernie Fitzpatrick and John Shepard. The investigators systematically eliminated suspect after suspect, but found no genetic match. Frustrated by the lack of viable leads and the degradation of historical evidence, the Special Task Force was disbanded in March 1995, leaving Christine Jessop's murder as a chillingly dormant cold case. While the criminal investigation stalled, the staggering magnitude of the systemic failures that had condemned an innocent man demanded a public reckoning. On June 26, 1996, the Government of Ontario ordered a formal public inquiry into the miscarriage of justice, appointing former Quebec Court of Appeal Judge Fred Kaufman as the commissioner. The Kaufman Commission commenced hearings on February 10, 1997, embarking on a grueling 146-day process that called 120 witnesses and carefully scrutinized over 100,000 pages of documents. The culmination of this exhaustive probe was the Kaufman Report, released on April 9, 1998. Spanning 1,380 pages, the landmark document delivered a scathing indictment of the investigation and prosecution. Kaufman concluded that while authorities may not have intended to frame an innocent man, they were afflicted by tunnel vision of the most staggering proportions, actively ignoring exculpatory evidence to forcefully fit Morin into their predetermined theory. The report thoroughly discredited the Crown's reliance on incentivized, pathological jailhouse informants and exposed severe institutional bias at the Center of Forensic Sciences, CFS, ruling that the hair and fiber evidence used to convict Morin was essentially valueless, overstated, and scientifically unsupported. The release of the Kaufman Report proved to be a watershed moment for the Canadian legal system, generating 119 systemic recommendations that fundamentally restructured police and prosecutorial protocols. Kaufman's directives mandated that all custodial suspect interviews be audio and video recorded to prevent coercion and preserve exact contexts. It established strict new registries and reliability assessments for the use of jailhouse informants, and demanded that forensic scientists operate as objective officers of the court, delivering written opinions in plain language rather than acting as partisan extensions of the prosecution. The report also called for ongoing education to combat cognitive bias among investigators and advocated for the creation of a national DNA databank to help solve cold cases. Ultimately, the Kaufman Report became arguably the most comprehensive judicial review of wrongful convictions ever undertaken in Canada, shifting the jurisprudential landscape and laying the critical groundwork for future systemic reforms to protect the innocent. Following the release of the Kaufman Report in April 1998, Guy Paul Morin largely retreated from the public eye to embrace a peaceful, ordinary life. Having received a public apology and $1.25 million in compensation from the Ontario government, Morin settled in the Toronto suburb of Mississauga with his wife, Allison, a police dispatcher he had met during his incarceration. Moving past his decade-long nightmare, he focused on building a family, welcoming children, and establishing a quiet career as a self-employed handyman and piano tuner. The Jessop family remained trapped in an agonizing state of grief and uncertainty, burdened by the reality that the true perpetrator was still at large. The horrific ordeal fundamentally fractured their family dynamic, resulting in Bob and Janet separating and moving into different residences. While Janet dedicated herself to victim advocacy and maintained a relentless, decades-long pursuit to find her daughter's killer, Christine's older brother, Kenny, grappled with severe personal demons. Traumatized by his childhood and the protracted legal saga, Kenny battled alcoholism and psychiatric struggles for many years before eventually finding sobriety. The criminal investigation, meanwhile, had gone dormant. When the task force formed in 1995 following Morin's acquittal disbanded, the preserved DNA profile extracted from the semen stains on Christine's underwear sat in national databases without a single hit for the next 25 years. The turning point that would finally break the stalemate arrived in 2020 through Detective Sergeant Steve Smith of the Toronto Police Service's Cold Case Unit, who had followed the Jessop tragedy since his youth. Seeking new avenues to solve the dormant investigation, Smith attended a specialized 2-week training course detailing the innovative forensic methods recently used by American law enforcement to apprehend the notorious Golden State Killer. Recognizing the potential of this emerging science, Smith realized that the decades-old semen sample preserved from the crime scene could be subjected to these advanced DNA techniques. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. To execute this vision, Smith partnered with Othram Inc., a specialized forensic genomics laboratory based in Houston, Texas. Unlike traditional forensic DNA analysis that relies on short tandem repeat profiling to find an exact identity match, Othram utilized single nucleotide polymorphism microarray sequencing, a highly advanced technique capable of mapping hundreds of thousands of genetic markers across degraded historical samples. Armed with this comprehensive new genomic data, forensic genetic genealogist Anthony Redgrave and his research team spent months constructing a massive family tree. They accomplished this by identifying distant relatives who had voluntarily uploaded their DNA profiles to public consumer databases, such as GadMatch and Family Tree DNA. Through systematic genetic triangulation, Redgrave's team successfully traced the lineage back to a specific ancestral couple, ultimately identifying a second cousin once removed as a critical genetic anchor. The careful genealogical research required digging through vast, complex family lineages until a 19-year-old university intern named Olivia McCarter located 3 children listed on an Ontario voting record as living in the same household. This specific record led the genealogist directly to the name Calvin Dana Hoover. Born in Ontario in 1956 into a large family with deep historical roots, Calvin Dana Hoover grew up to lead a life that appeared remarkably ordinary before descending into a decades-long spiral of instability and hidden guilt. In 1977, at the age of 21, Hoover met 20-year-old Heather, embarking on a long-term relationship. Hoover formally adopted Heather's 2 young sons from a previous relationship, and the couple subsequently had 2 more sons together, establishing a bustling household of 6 in the North Scarborough suburb of Toronto. Professionally, Hoover built a career as a telecommunications cable installer and technician. It was a position that required frequent travel across Ontario and occasionally took him to cities like Dallas, Washington, and Chicago for specialized training courses. More importantly, this career path served as the direct catalyst for his fateful integration into the Jessop family's inner circle. Hoover and his wife were both employed at Eastern Independent Telecom, where Heather worked as a dispatcher, Calvin as a cable installer, and Bob Jessop as the lead hand supervising the installation crew. United by this professional link, the 2 families formed a tight social bond. Janet Jessop and Heather Hoover became close friends, frequently visiting one another, organizing play dates for their children, and hosting shared backyard barbecues. Heather often babysat 9-year-old Christine, who grew highly fond of the Hoovers' youngest toddler, and had even visited their North Scarborough residence in the days immediately preceding her disappearance. For nearly a decade following the murder, Hoover maintained a life of normalcy. He continued his telecom work and routinely consoled his wife as she made visits to Christine's gravesite. However, the 1990s marked the beginning of a severe personal, financial, and psychological decline, which police investigators later speculated was driven by intense, unaddressed guilt over the homicide. In 1991, Hoover filed for personal bankruptcy, and as his drug and alcohol addictions worsened, his marriage deteriorated. Heather later described the final years of their marriage as hell, leading to their permanent separation in late 1993. Hoover's behavior grew increasingly unstable and erratic. During one social gathering in the mid-1990s, he pulled out a pocket knife and aggressively carved into a host's kitchen table while drinking. Living a fractured existence, Hoover relocated frequently between temporary residences in North York, Pickering, Ajax, Oshawa, and Waterdown. He accumulated a minor criminal record, which included a 1996 guilty plea for impaired driving. His long-term mental health struggles were finally recognized medically around 2010 or 11 when he was formally diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Once Hoover's name was in the hands of law enforcement, the investigation shifted from cutting-edge science back to classic detective work. Staff Superintendent Peter Code emphasized that genetic genealogy merely provides a potential family lineage, leaving it up to investigators to dig through historical records, obituaries, and case files to winnow their search. The Toronto Police Cold Case Unit, operating under the direction of Detective Sergeant Steve Smith, combed through the massive, computerized investigative files from 1984. They realized that Hoover's name appeared in connection with two specific families within the genetic lineage, and a review of the old records revealed a chilling detail. Calvin Hoover was already in the police files as a known associate with a direct connection to the Jessop family. As detectives rushed to build a full timeline and locate their prime suspect, their pursuit hit an abrupt wall. They discovered that Hoover had died by suicide via carbon monoxide poisoning in Port Hope, Ontario in 2015, putting him forever out of reach of a criminal trial. However, this grim realization ultimately provided the final piece of the puzzle. Investigators learned that following Hoover's death, a standard autopsy had been performed, and a post-mortem blood sample had been routinely preserved and kept on file at the Centre of Forensic Sciences Laboratory in Toronto. This stroke of luck allowed police to bypass the need to covertly collect a DNA sample from a living suspect. On October 9, 2020, authorities directly compared the autopsy blood sample to the preserved semen from the 1984 crime scene, resulting in a conclusive 100% DNA match that definitively identified Hoover as Christine Jessop's killer. It was the profound level of trust by the Jessops that Hoover exploited on the afternoon of October 3, 1984. Fully aware that Bob Jessop was incarcerated and that Janet was away visiting him, Hoover abducted Christine, likely under the guise of taking her to see her father. He drove the young girl to a rustic family cabin near Lake Scugog in Sunderland, a secluded area he was intimately familiar with from outdoor excursions with an old-school friend, where he sexually assaulted and murdered her. Astonishingly, Hoover then seamlessly reintegrated himself into the grieving community, deflecting any suspicion by participating in the local search parties, attending Christine's wake and funeral, and personally consoling the Jessop family in their home. Because he was deeply embedded in their circle of friends, investigators who were intensely focused on Guy Paul Morin never formally questioned Hoover or recognized him as a viable suspect. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. On October 15, 2020, the decades-long mystery of 9-year-old Christine Jessop's murder reached a stunning resolution when Toronto police announced that advanced genetic genealogy had identified Calvin Dana Hoover as her killer. For the Jessop family, the revelation brought a dizzying wave of relief, layered with profound feelings of betrayal. Hoover was not a nameless predator, but a trusted member of their inner circle. The identification of a close ally forced the Jessop family to reconcile the horrific truth with the years they had spent directing their hatred toward their eccentric next-door neighbor, Guy Paul Morin. Christine's older brother, Kenny Jessop, expressed that the family was happily stunned, but grappling with deep betrayal, noting that Hoover's identity made harrowing sense. Kenny remarked that from day one, he had believed the perpetrator was someone who intimately knew the family and their whereabouts, stating that it all fits together now. This grim realization stood in stark contrast to their previous certainty regarding Morin, whom Janet had once confidently branded stupid and the killer. Kenny, who had publicly threatened Morin following his 1985 arrest, had previously admitted upon Morin's exoneration to feeling brainwashed by police into believing his neighbor was guilty. In the wake of the 2020 revelation, Morin issued a statement through his lawyer demonstrating remarkable grace. Rather than expressing bitterness over the Jessops' past hostility, he stated he was grateful the real killer was found and expressed relief for Janet and her family, hoping the news would finally bring them peace of mind. In the years following the identification of Hoover, the lives of those most affected by the tragedy saw both quiet resolution and lingering sorrow. Janet Jessop, having relentlessly sought justice for nearly 4 decades, finally found peace before passing away on March 15, 2024. Kenny Jessop successfully overcame his severe personal demons, achieving sobriety on March 7, 2022, and subsequently dedicating himself to helping others struggling with grief and addiction. On the 40th anniversary of Christine's disappearance in October 2024, Kenny buried his mother alongside his sister. Meanwhile, Guy Paul Morin largely retreated from the public eye, building a quiet life in Mississauga, Ontario, with his wife Allison and their 2 sons, attempting to leave his decade-long legal nightmare behind. However, the scars of his wrongful conviction proved indelible. In October 2024, Morin publicly reflected that despite being scientifically proven innocent, he still faced the enduring stigma of people viewing him as a killer. The legacy of the Christine Jessop case ultimately culminated in sweeping jurisprudential evolution and final legal developments aimed at preventing future miscarriages of justice. The systemic failures exposed by Morin's wrongful conviction originally led to the creation of the Association in Defense of the Wrongly Convicted, now Innocence Canada, and the landmark Kaufman Report, which fundamentally restructured Canadian police training, suspect interviewing, and forensic science protocols. By December 17, 2024, these systemic reform efforts achieved a monumental milestone with the royal assent of Bill C-40, also known as the Miscarriage of Justice Review Commission Act, or David and Joyce Milgaard's Law. This federal legislation formally removed the responsibility for reviewing potential wrongful convictions from the purview of the federal Minister of Justice, entrusting it instead to an independent commission. Morin himself participated in the legislative hearings for this historic law, using his tragic experience to advocate for a more accountable judicial system. Ultimately, the Jessop-Morin saga illustrates the devastating consequences of investigative tunnel vision and reliance on flawed forensic science, while also demonstrating the remarkable ability of advances in genetic analysis to correct historical miscarriages of justice. The case remains a dark yet transformative chapter in Canadian history, forever marked by the irreversible human toll borne by 2 families and their enduring pursuit of the truth.